Guys, it's Miss Weinberger again. I am going to go through what you're going to be doing in reading class this week, our new reading strategy, our learning goal for the week, and model that strategy for you. This week we have a third strategy. We learned metacognition in week 2, which is just thinking about the text while we read, keeping our brain focused. Last week in week 3, we learned all about visualizing, making a picture in our mind as we read. And this week we have a new strategy for week 4. We're learning to make connections to the text. So this is our learning goal for the week. I am learning to make connections to help me understand the text. And what making connections basically means is thinking about what we're reading in the text and how it can relate to something that we already know about in our life. And there's 3 different types of connections that we're going to be learning about this week, okay? So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you. We're going to go through a slideshow to learn about the 3 types of connections and how they can help us understand what we read, okay? So what are connections? So basically connections are links that the readers can make between what they are reading and things they already know. Okay, so let's say I'm reading a story about a football game. So I can think in my brain, what do I know about football games? I know what a football field looks like. I know how you score points. I know what the football itself looks like. So I'm going to take everything that I have in my brain that I already know about football that might help me understand the story better, okay? So why should we make connections? Well, simply because making a connection helps us understand what we're reading better. It would be kind of silly for me to be reading about a football game and to not think about what I already know about football that could help me. I know lots of things about football, so when in the story the person scores a touchdown, I'm not going to say, well, I wonder what that means. I'm going to say, oh, wait, I know what a touchdown is because I have that in my background knowledge already and I can make a connection to that. So that's why we make connections, because they help us to understand what we're reading. Okay, so how do we make connections? It says good readers use their own background knowledge and prior experiences to make connections. This is kind of like last week when we were visualizing, and we talked about visualizing a green tractor. And we talked about how everybody visualizes a little bit differently because we visualize based on what we already know and our background knowledge, and we call that our schema. And we'll talk more about schema as we learn about making connections this week. All right, there are 3 different ways that a reader can make connections, or 3 different types of connections, okay? Text to self, text to text, and text to world. So we're going to talk about each of those kinds of connections. So text to self, these are connections that readers make between the text, what you're reading, and their own past experiences and or background knowledge. So if I'm reading about football and I play football, that's a text to self connection. If I'm connecting that text, I'm reading about football to a time that I played football or I went to a football game, that's text to self. And this is the most of the connections that we make when we read our text to self. The second type of connection is text to text. These are connections that readers make between the text they are reading and other texts the reader has read before. So if I'm reading a story about football and I read another story about football, and I can make some connections there, that's text to text. We can make a lot of text to text connections if we read books in the same series. So if you like Magic Tree House and you read the first book and then you read the second book, you're going to be able to make lots of text to text connections between the characters, between the events, things that have happened. So we can make lots of text to text connections that way. Something that people don't think about as being texts, but are songs, poems, plays, even movies and television are considered another text, because when you're watching a movie, the actors are acting off of a script that somebody else has written. That's a type of text. So if I'm reading about a football game and it reminds me of a movie that I've seen about football, that's considered text to text. The third type of connection, and I think the hardest one to make, are text to world connections. So these are connections that readers make between the text and the bigger issues, events, or concerns of society. So if I'm reading about football and I think about something that happened in a football game that I saw in the news or something that's going on in the NFL, that's a text to world connection. Okay, to make these types of connections, the reader must think about what is going on in the world around them. So for us as kids, sometimes it's harder to make those connections because we don't know a lot of what's happening out in the world. So I think that's kind of the hardest connection for us to try to make, okay? Okay, so there are different thinking stems that we use when we make connections. The one that we're mainly going to focus on this week is that reminds me of. So I believe, I think it's on Tuesday this week, you guys will do a thinking stem in your journal. Remember, these thinking stems just get us thinking and help us to practice our strategy that we're learning, okay? All right, so I'm going to model making connections with you guys with one of my absolute favorite books that I use in my reading classes. This book is called The Relatives Came by Cynthia Rylant. And so I'm going to show you how to make connections while you read. I'm going to model some connections for you, and I'm also going to use my thinking stem that reminds me of that we just talked about. And I love the pictures in this book. Okay, it says, it was in the summer of the year when the relatives came. And guys, if you don't know, relatives are your family members, okay? They came up from Virginia. They left when their grapes were nearly purple enough to pick, but not quite. So you can see they're getting ready to take a trip. They're loading down the car, it looks like. They had an old station wagon that smelled like a real car, and in it they put an ice chest full of soda pop, it's like a cooler, and some boxes of crackers and some bologna sandwiches. And they came up from Virginia. They left at 4 in the morning when it was still dark, before even the birds were awake. I have a connection to this. That reminds me of when my family goes on trips. So we always pack snacks to have in the car because sometimes we get hungry and we don't want to stop to get food. So we usually pack snacks. That also reminds me the part where they got up and they left early. When we go on trips, most of the time, if it's a long drive, we leave really early when it's still dark outside. Do you have a connection to that? If your family's ever taken a trip, you might be able to make a connection. So that's a text to self connection. They drove all day long and into the night, and while they traveled along, they looked at the strange houses and different mountains, and they thought about their almost purple grapes back home. They thought about Virginia, but they thought about us too, waiting for them. So they drank up all their pop and ate up all their crackers and traveled up all those miles until finally they pulled into our yard. Look, they came in quick, didn't they? Knocking the fence down, their luggage is flying everywhere. Then it was hugging time. Talk about hugging. Those relatives just passed us all around their car, pulling us against their wrinkled Virginia clothes, crying sometimes. They hugged us for hours. This reminds me of whenever I see family members that I haven't seen for a long time, we always give each other lots of hugs. Then it was into the house and so much laughing and shining faces and hugging in the doorways. You'd have to go through at least 4 different hugs to get from the kitchen to the front room. Those relatives. Look at all the hugging and laughing and smiling. I think they were happy to see each other. And finally, after a big supper, 2 or 3 times around until we all got a turn at the table, there was quiet talk, and we were in 2s and 3s through the house. That reminds me of my grandmother's house. When we have holiday celebrations, we eat a big meal, and then everybody kind of breaks off into little groups to talk and catch up. The relatives weren't particular about beds, which was good since there weren't any extras. So a few squeezed in with us, and the rest slept on the floor. Some with their arms thrown over the closest person, or some with an arm across one person and a leg across another. It was different going to sleep with all that new breathing in the house. The relatives stayed for weeks and weeks. They helped us tend the garden, and they fixed any broken things they could find. They ate up all our strawberries and melons, then promised we could eat up all their grapes and peaches when we came to Virginia. Look at all the different things they're doing together. Seems like they really love each other. But none of us thought about Virginia much. We were so busy hugging and eating and breathing together. Finally, after a long time, the relatives loaded up their ice chest and headed back to Virginia at 4 in the morning. We stood there in our pajamas and waved them off in the dark. We watched the relatives disappear down the road. Then we crawled back into our beds that felt too big and too quiet. We fell asleep. And the relatives drove on all day long and into the night. And while they traveled along, they looked at the strange houses and different mountains, and they thought about their dark purple grapes waiting at home in Virginia. But they thought about us too, missing them, and they missed us. And when they were finally home in Virginia, they crawled into their silent, soft beds and dreamed about the next summer. I hope you could see how I was able to make connections to the text at different parts, and I hope you were able to make some connections too. Now, I was making text to self connections, and that's kind of what you're probably going to start out with doing when you're doing your independent reading, is text to self. But I also want you to work this week a little bit on seeing if you can make some text to text and text to world connections. Okay, I'm going to go through the activities that you are going to be working on this week, okay? So on Monday, you're going to look through the slideshow that we just went through together. So look at that again and think about the different types of connections that you can make, okay? You're going to read for 10 minutes and list any connections that you can make in your journal. On Tuesday, you're going to be looking at, let me share my screen with you. This is in your packet. You're going to be looking at the anchor chart and this little text to self, text to text, text to world bookmark. And you're going to be thinking about the 3 different types of connections. And as you read today for independent reading time, you're going to write down a thinking stem. This reminds me of in your journal, okay? And you can write down more than one if you have more than one connection, okay? On Thursday, because there's no school again on Wednesday, on Thursday, this sheet is in your packet. It says make a connection up at the top. So while you're reading today, I want you to try to make a text to text, text to self, and text to world connection, okay? If you're having trouble, it's okay. If you can't think of one, you might need to ask an adult for help with the text to world, but just do the very best that you can, okay? On Friday, you have a Google form to fill out that looks like this. It says making connections. Now you can do the paper version or you can do it digitally on Google Classroom. So I'm going to show you how to get there on my screen. Let me exit out of here real quick. Well, if it will let me exit out. There we go. Okay, so you're going to go to Ms. Weinbarger's Google Classroom. You're going to go to class work. And this week is now week 4. So if you look under week 4 materials, I have a little bit better organized this week than I did last week. So everything that you need for the week pretty much is already posted here. The slideshow that we just looked at, the anchor charts that we looked at, and here's your quiz. So you're going to click on Making Connections Quiz. And then click right here. It says Making Connections Google Forms. And these are the exact same questions that I just showed you on the paper copies. So if you would prefer to take it digitally, you can do that. Just make sure that you click Submit down at the bottom, okay? So that is basically this week in reading class, okay? As always, if you need anything, if you need help, you can send me a message on Doja or an email. I do want to give you one reminder about iReady, okay? All of our 1A and 1B students are expected to get 45 minutes of reading iReady minutes every week, okay? Some of you guys are rocking that out. Some of you guys are not getting any minutes in or you're just getting a few. So make sure at some point this week you log on to iReady and you get 45 minutes of reading practice, okay? If you're having trouble getting logged in, make sure your parents send me a message on Dojo and I will help you with that, okay? All right, I hope you guys have a great week and I'll be seeing you soon.